Some doors are locked for a reason. When 11-year-old Nora Davis was up in her bedroom doing homework, she had no idea her father was killing women in the basement. Until the day the police arrived at their front door. Decades later, Nora's father is spending his life behind bars, and Nora is a successful surgeon with a quiet, solitary existence. Nobody knows her father was a notorious serial killer, and she intends to keep it that way. Then Nora discovers one of her young female patients has been murdered in the same unique and horrific manner that her father used to kill his victims. Somebody knows who Nora is. Somebody wants her to take the fall for this unthinkable crime. But she's not a killer like her father. The police can't pin anything on her. As long as they don't look in her basement. Alright, welcome back to Reading as Writers, where we train ourselves on how to be bigger, better, clever writers, one book at a time. Today, under the microscope, we have The Locked Door by Frida McFadden. I have 12 pages of notes printed, and then I also have several handwritten. So we're just gonna take this one section at a time. First, what actually happens in this story besides just what we see in the synopsis? Because this synopsis is not very detailed. Here's what happens. Attending surgeon Nora Davis is an adult daughter of the infamous serial killer Aaron Neerling, aka the Handyman. In his reign of terror, he kidnapped at least 18 women and killed them, keeping their hands as a trophy. You know, these guys. I had a D&D villain who did that. He is caught when Nora is about 11, and she's the one who reports him to the police when she finds a victim in his basement workshop. Nora hoped that the police would show up in time to save the victim, but unfortunately, she was dead when the police arrived. 1 decade later, a copycat killer is on the hunt, and their victims are all past patients of Nora's. The cop in town thinks Nora did it because her father is a serial killer, but nobody else knows who Nora's parents are. Not her one that got away, turned second chance guy in her life, Brady, nor Dr. Philip Corey, her partner surgeon at their private practice. As everything closes in, Nora is startled, sure that at least one of these men loves her, and the other wants to frame her for the copycat killings. But when Nora is brought to her own basement during her dark night of the soul, it's Philip that's tied up, hand severed. Harper, the secretary at Nora's private practice, was actually this can't be right, Nora's long-lost sister, who was born prematurely after their mother willingly bit the dust in a jail cell, and then was adopted out to a family with the records sealed. Who, when she turned 18, she concealed those records, got in contact with serial killer dad, decided to frame Nora for the murder because she blames Nora. Because Nora put dad in prison, and I guess that ruined Harper's life at having a normal family, with serial killer dad. And then she's captured alive and given 2 life sentences for murders and probably HIPAA violations.
Who are you? I'm from the IRS, and I've come to attack your...
Mediocre thrillers don't want you to know who the bad guy is until they want you to know. They're very obsessed with the big dramatic reveal. And it never works for me. And in McFadden's case, it's really disappointing because she set up Philip Corey, the other surgeon. He's a red herring, but she set him up so well that she should have just made him the bad guy. And I would have given this novel an extra star. It still would have been 3 stars, but pro math tip 2 is smaller than 3. Therefore, 3 is still better than 2. So we're going to start with the stuff that worked. The first thing I want to look at is the prologue. So books can be pretty difficult to begin. Everyone has a different opinion on how you start one. And everyone is both incorrect and correct at the same time. You start it how it makes sense to you. But a prologue is defined as an introduction to the literary work. Before we get into the Locked Doors prologue, I want to talk about Romeo and Juliet's prologue. 2 households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge breaks to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean.
From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage, to which if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend.
In simple terms, this prologue says two noble houses don't like each other, the feud goes back far that nobody even remembers anymore, and it reaches the apex when the children are getting themselves killed because of it, and the deaths force the families to confront their generational trauma and how it kills, and they work to mend it so that way no more kids get hurt in the process. And I want to specifically highlight the first four lines. I think these, when you think of the prologue of Romeo and Juliet, the first four lines are what most people remember. And I'm pretty sure it's because the movie only uses the first four lines.
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge breaks to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean.
Two noble houses in Verona violently hate each other for as long as they can remember, and will shed blood if called for. Just these four lines give us all of the relevant backstory we need to know about these two families. We don't need to go into great detail about why these two families hate each other. All that matters is that they do. And they have no problem killing each other in the streets. It's a genius prologue, and it's one of the best prologues I've personally encountered, despite the fact that I think Romeo and Juliet is Shakespeare's dumbest play. I didn't enjoy it, but the prologue slaps. And that's what we want prologues to do. They need to be an introduction to help colorize the world that we are about to go into. But we don't want to spend a lot of time in the prologue. If you're spending too much time in the prologue, then it sounds like you need to start the story earlier and your prologue is just a chapter one. The Locked Doors prologue is this very fact-oriented, like, case reading of Aaron Neerling's crimes. It's like listening to like a case briefing at the beginning of a true crime podcast episode. It's just capturing the highlights while giving us time to ask some questions. Like how the wife, she was arrested and is allegedly an accessory to these murders, and she willingly bites the dust before the trial. Why does she do that? Does that mean she's guilty? And then it ends so well because we get this case briefing, and then we get, he's also my dad. Boom. We now know everything we need to know. We've got the case briefing. We know that it's her dad. She's clearly not happy about this. It's so great. What I think is the greatest part about it is that it's very quickly catching us up to speed on everything we need to know about infamous serial killer Aaron Neerling. So when we enter the world state, we know as much as anyone else. And then it's kind of funny when there's this one scene, which is the first payoff, is that they're playing a trivia game at the bar, and one of the questions, the answer is Aaron Neerling, and like people just know it off the top of their heads. That was like a really fun thing to immediately pay off of us getting this case. It was such a clever opener. You know, there's no right or wrong prologues, only prologues people get away with and prologues people don't get away with. If you have so much lore that you need to get through in the prologue, that's again an indication that you need to start earlier in the story. And I think both Romeo and Juliet's and this prologue work really well because they're very short and they just kind of hit us with the highlights of everything we need. Who is Mr. Philip Corey? Philip is this unapologetic rake who is divorced because he couldn't keep it in his pants and was sleeping around with the nurses that he works with. And he is like almost a secondary love interest and a red herring for the copycat killer. I wouldn't necessarily say that Nora is in a love triangle because she never considers Philip a viable option. There's just these moments where she and Philip seem to have very genuine chemistry, and it makes you think, she's getting rejected by the other love interest, but here comes him kind of showing up in her hour of need, and there's some chemistry, and possibility there, but Nora never considers Philip an option. So I wouldn't say he's a love interest, but he's kind of in that zone. And it's one of Philip's constants that he will always show up to help. That's Philip's constant throughout the book, is that when Nora needs help, Philip always shows up to help. Now, Philip runs this private two-surgeon practice, and he singled out Nora to be his partner after her residency. I believe both of them are attending surgeons at this point. There's never a point where she seems to be a resident, because I believe residents are doctors who are like learning how to be doctors. I don't know anything about the medical field in terms of its education system. So the fact that Philip was really insistent to work with Nora, and specifically Nora, is sort of our red flag number one of, is Philip involved in this in some insidious way? He did single her out, and that's weird. Nora's work cup goes missing, and she's very quick to presume Philip broke it and that he just threw it away and then didn't tell her. This is McFadden pointing us towards Philip as a potential suspect because she wants to misdirect us away from Harper. She doesn't ever want us to consider Harper an option, so she's going to be constantly pushing us in the direction of either Brady or Philip, and it's going to get frustrating. This cup resurfaces at an active crime scene. There's a cup found with her fingerprints on it, and so this is sort of red flag number 2. That cup came from Nora's workplace, so it's gotta be somebody in the workplace. Then, in this crucial moment, it is revealed that Philip is the only person who knows where Nora lives. Nora is paranoid, reasonably paranoid, in my opinion, but she's paranoid. She doesn't give out her phone number or address with anyone. She has this very deep sense of mistrust. She goes on a one night stand with Brady. She refuses to give him her phone number. Brady gives Nora his phone number, but she's like, I'm never gonna text him because then he'll have my number. And then she refuses to drive in his car. They drive 2 cars to his house for a one night stand, and she's absolutely like, you cannot drive me back. She's so insistent on limiting who knows where she lives. And this McFadden did something very genius here, and I'm so upset that it didn't get used to its fullest potential, because the reader can assume at this point, because of how paranoid Nora is, that her giving out her number and address is, if we don't see her give it out, it's likely to assume that it hasn't been given out and that nobody knows it unless we see her give it out. Thus, it allows us to be looking for people who know her address, because someone is framing her for murder and they're planting stuff in her home. So you have to think, who who is arriving? Who knows? We need that more than anything, because I believe Nora is stalked at some point, and it turns out to be this guy named Sunny, and I don't believe Sunny ever actually made it to her home, and Sunny is the person who will tell the killer where Nora lives, maybe. So if he never makes it there, then he can never tell the person he's working with. So like, it's a big deal that nobody knows where Nora lives. So if you're tracking who knows where Nora lives, you could figure out who the killer is. So when Nora calls Philip, and Philip says, A, you only call me when it's an emergency, and B, he drives to her house without Nora giving him an address, we can put it together that Philip has to be involved. Because there's currently blood in Nora's basement, right? When he comes over, there is currently blood in Nora's basement. And Brady had only just learned where Nora lived that night because her tires got slashed. So Brady drove her home, and then Nora got home, and then she calls Philip because she needs help with something. He arrives, he helps, he leaves, she goes to the basement, and there's blood in there. And she had eyes on Philip the entire time, so Philip couldn't have done it while he was there. But basically, you kind of, if you're paying attention to the little details, at this point, once Philip shows up, it's like, he knows where she lives? Bro, it has to be him. But it's not. In actuality, it was Harper doing all of this, so I guess we just assume that Harper knew where Nora lived because Harper is the secretary. And most of the conclusions, because Harper is the secretary, that's where most of these conclusions end, is that I guess it's not Philip and it's Harper because I guess she's the secretary. So even if she's not really friends with Nora, I guess she has access to all of the information, and that's just not fun because I'm hunting for clues and I'm trying to solve it with Nora, but there's no evidence to point it at Harper because Frieda McFadden she didn't want me to figure it out. She wanted me to fall into her little trap, and then she goes, "Gotcha, it's actually Harper. Here's all the evidence that you missed, except for I didn't miss it because you didn't put it in there in the first place for me to figure it out. It's not clever, it's just mean."
Are you guys seeing the pattern here? We got big questions at both of these crime scenes with no answers.
At the very end of the novel, Philip is revealed to have no patients in the hospital, or it's the private practice. I get confused the difference between the private practice and the hospital, but at the very end, when Nora is trying to look at a specific patient, she kind of lies and says, "Oh, I'm checking in on Philip's patients." And the nurse says he doesn't have any patients. And I think that was supposed to be a red herring, or a part of the red herring that it's Philip, because if he doesn't have patience, why? He's a surgeon. He should be having patience. That's his job. And you could conclude that he doesn't have patience because he's been going around being the copycat killer. But again, this is just something that is either never addressed because it wasn't relevant and it was just meant to misdirect us from Harper, or it was just a coincidence that he didn't have any patients in recovery because he hadn't been doing surgeries in the last 2 weeks, I think. I don't know. It seems pretty suspicious to me. And finally, and this is the most damning one, and the one that is the most frustrating, and it's that Philip, he he's the only one who knew that Nora had called an installation company to put in a security system. He's the only person who heard that conversation. So later, when Nora gets an email saying somebody called and canceled it, or they rescheduled it to be later in the week, she's like, "What do you mean? Nobody knew I did that except for Philip." Again, it ends up being a red herring. This red herring, this specific piece of false information or misdirection, it was planted. I just don't think it was planted very well. So when you want people to believe something is plausible in writing, you have to introduce it ahead of time. It's called planting the gun. The reverse of this is Chekhov's gun. Chekhov's gun says that if you decide to put a gun in the first chapter, it needs to go off at chapters 2 or 3. Planting the gun is the reverse. If you need a gun in Act 3, you have to put it in Act 1. So with this, you have to see, or it's also called seeding information. You have to seed it. You have to put it in there. And it just, I don't think it was done well, because it's not enough to just put it in there. You have to put it in at the right time, and you have to put it in the right way. So the way that this is rationalized within the world logic is that Harper overheard Philip talk to a nurse about the security installation, or Philip was gossiping to Harper about the security installation. And by this point, Nora has already learned that Philip gossips about this, like, surgery contest between the two of them of who can do the most surgeries in 1 year. People are gossiping about that because Philip is telling everybody, and I keep wanting to call him Steven. I don't know why, but every time I just hiccup, it's because I want to call him Steven. I really hope his name isn't Steven and that I've just been calling him Philip this entire time. Anyways, so Philip talks about this bet to other nurses. One of the other nurses is aware that Nora is in legal trouble because Philip has gossiped to her about that, and Nora is very overwhelmed because she's like, why is Philip doing this? Why is he gossiping about me? I don't like people knowing things about me. I feel icky. So we're supposed to believe, that's why, when Harper's like, oh, I heard Philip talking about it, we're supposed to be like, that's reasonable. That doesn't feel like it came out of nowhere. We have all of these instances of Philip doing that in the past, so it seems reasonable. But for me, and this might work for other people, it's subjective, but for me it doesn't work because he's never gossiping to Harper. It's always another nurse. And I can't actually remember if he gossiped to Harper or if he gossiped to a nurse that Harper overheard. It's just Harper is never in the scene. Harper is never mentioned in these moments, and because she's never mentioned in these moments, I have a harder time believing that Harper would be at the right place in the right time. Other people will probably disagree with me and think that I'm nitpicking. I just know that because this author was so desperate for us not to think of Harper, she refused to put Harper anywhere. And I think it would have been better if she had put Harper at least in those scenes, so that way we would be like, oh yeah, he gossips to Harper all the time. But of course, if he gossips to Harper all the time, somebody could be like, well, maybe it's Harper, and Frieda McFadden didn't want that. So she would not do anything to make anyone think that because she doesn't want the reader to figure it out. It's frustrating, but I digress. I think that he should have been gossiping to Harper because then it's just not as clever as Frieda McFadden wants it to be. But again, this part, that this little detail is so nitpicky, I can understand if you disagree with me. Art is subjective. Who is Philip Corey, this unapologetic rake, who we follow along most of the time? He is our distraction. He's the red herring. Every time Frieda McFadden is attempting to seed information, she's basically hiding Harper underneath Philip because all of the evidence that we're like, it has to be Philip because he has all this access. Technically, Harper has it too because she also works in the same place. The problem with it is that Philip Corey was planted so well. It's so impressive. Do you know how impressive it is that I'm like in the middle of the book just realizing that it ha if it's her patience, if it's Nora's patience, then it has to be someone at the practice. And by that point, she had already pointed out the cup. And so I was like, the cup went missing. And the cup showed up at a crime scene. I was like, it has to be Philip, specifically because that cup, Frieda points us in the direction of Philip, because Nora's like, oh, my cup is missing. Philip must have done something to it. So we're pointed in the direction of Philip. But yeah, he is seated so well. She worked so hard on this red herring that she should have just made him the villain. Because then I would feel smart for figuring it out. And it would have been great, but she didn't. She decided to go with Harper, which is a choice, and I respect that. I just disagree. I love characters who cause problems on purpose. I just love people who are there to just be a problem. And this story has one. It's an old lady with dementia. And she is the best red herring in the entire story because she shows up, she gives it her all, and then she leaves. And she is so unapologetically a problem all the time. And I love her for this. This reminds me of like the old Russian couple from Cyberstorm by Matthew Mather. I didn't really love Cyberstorm, but the old Russian couple, I was like, yeah, you go! They're eating people! Go them! I just. If you can get me to root for a cannibal, I think you should just take my stars. But this old lady, when we meet her, we don't actually interact with her. Brady brings Nora home. They're gonna be a one night stand, and the lady's just kind of like rocking on a rocking chair out on the porch. And he's like, "Yeah, that's my landlady. I know it's kind of embarrassing. I have a landlady, but whatever. I bet you wish we went to your apartment. And Nora was like, no. And he was like, right, because you don't want me to know where you live. And she's like, that's correct, Brady. And I, first of all, respect the drip. Secondly, this old lady, that's her first name. She's just rocking back and forth, being an old lady, doing as old lady do. Then the next time we see her, she's at the supermarket, and Nora recognizes her. And from this point on, she's always seen with her niece or her nurse. I can't quite remember it. But she sees Nora, recognizes Nora, and is like, I hear women screaming from Brady's apartment. He does terrible things to them. And that's exactly, I listened to this on audiobook because audiobooks are reading. The audiobook narrator was, she was subpar. I'm sorry, you were kind of subpar. But the old lady voice was great. And Nora's like, you hear people scream? And she's like, all the time. And the nurse or the niece shows up and she's like, sorry, she has dementia, la 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 la, and they go along their happy way. At this point, we know that Brady has a room in his apartment that is locked, and Nora doesn't know what's in it. And so Nora, because of her trauma with the locked door at her house with Aaron Neerling, she's like, what's behind that locked door? Maybe that's where he is torturing people. And then the old lady shows up one more time at the Dark Night of the Soul, where she's like, Brady is torturing women up there. I hear them scream. He's dangerous. And Nora, in this like moment of weakness, decides to believe her and panic. And it was great. It was a great way to push her into the climax. Now, it wasn't executed as well as I would have liked it to be. There's some plot shenanigan stuff that happens that I wasn't really in love with at that point, and we'll get into that later. But the idea was there that this old lady is kind of really insisting that Brady is harming women, and then because Nora is kind of back against the wall, has no idea who to trust, she has to, in that moment, decide is Brady the killer or not, and she decides he is, and she flees, and that's her mistake. So the idea was there, I just didn't think it was executed very well. The best character in this book was a cat. Yeah, just like you, Echo. When she moves into her house, she meets this stray cat and she feeds it. She puts cat food in the cat bowl, she puts the cat food outside, the cat just comes up and eat it, and that's sort of the relationship she has with this cat. And that's about as far as it goes. She doesn't invite it into her home, she doesn't name it, she doesn't do anything. She just has enough empathy for a stray cat that she has bought food and feeds it. Now, the cat serves a very important purpose. An important purpose that will get retold in much worse ways throughout the story, but the cat is the best version of it that we have. Is that the cat, as a writing, as a piece of the fiction, its purpose is to really show us about Nora and the fact that she is a sociopath. Because sociopaths, they don't have regards for most people's feelings. They have trouble relating to people. It's considered an antisocial disorder, right? So when they are expressing empathy and emotions, they're typically simulated, or it is something that they are actively having to practice and choose to do rather than something that comes naturally to them, like to most people. Nora is a sociopath. We learned that pretty early on, that she has inherited that potentially from her father. And the cat teaches us that though she is a sociopath, Nora is actively trying to lead a very compassionate, empathetic life. She is trying not to be the sort of stereotype of what you would expect of a sociopath. She's trying not to be her father. This cat also teaches us that Philip knows where Nora lives. Again, this cat, in terms of like information and lore, works so hard. Basically, what happens is that Nora, the cat, runs into the apartment, and Nora's like, I gotta get the cat out. I can't have a cat. And she like grabs it and feels its ribs, and she has like this intrusive thought to crush the cat's ribs, and so she lets go, and she's like, I can't do this. And she calls Philip. She's like, I need you to get rid of the cat. And he says something super lame, like, oh man, if you wanted to do a one night stand, you could just ask, and you didn't have to make up an excuse. And he doesn't end, he shows up, and he doesn't actually get the cat out, but he gets the cat off the couch, and for that, Nora seems to be satisfied. She's like, as long as the cat's off my couch and it's not peeing on it, sure, that's fine. He can live in my basement. And that sort of becomes, she has mapped something onto the basement that is new. You know, the basement has been this source of trauma for her because in her father's basement, that's where he was the handyman. That's where he was doing the killings. And so with the cat being remapped onto the basement, she is now having a positive association with the basement now that she is now associating with the cat and is no longer associating with the father. It's a very good symbol. And you know, as someone with CPTSD, that is sort of how you. It's a way that you can help really get over the things that hurt you. You know, that get over the things that hurt you. You know, I have a lot of um hold up about names, and so when somebody new into my life has the same name as someone who has hurt me, I get very anxious. And anytime I see that person or I hear about that person, you know, I'm brought back into the parts that weren't so nice. And it's not great, but you know, as this new person enters the scene and has more positive emotions and positive memories with them, I slowly become more relaxed around hearing their name. It's just you're just remapping new positive stuff on top of the old stuff that could have harmed you in the past. So this little trick of the basement she associated with the father, the basement she's now associating with the cat, that way that we can progress, great. I love it. I love the cat. And it's not just because I have cats, it's just the cat as a writing tool in this story was great. Great. Loved the cat. More of that. And also, the cat at the end does get a name. Its name is Meowsy. We love Meowsy. Live, laugh, Meowsy. Oh, I forgot. And the cat is a gun, right? It's a planted gun because, you know, when you have shootouts, especially when you have shootouts in close quarters, you have to come up with a reason why, you know, your main character doesn't get shot or, you know, why the enemy doesn't get shot. If you don't want people to die, you have to come up with a reason. And usually the reason is they miss, right? In most scenes, it's pretty easy to get away with. In this scene, it wasn't, though, because Harper has the gun pointed, like, directly at Nora. There's no way she can miss. It's like hitting the broadside of a barn. So now you're in this mess. You have two characters in this enclosed basement. The gun is really close. You can't just say she missed. The readers aren't going to buy that. So she has some options. Do you make the basement bigger? Do you pick a different location? And what she went with is that the cat attacks Harper. And because Harper, you know, I don't think her finger was on the trigger quite yet. She doesn't have time to shoot, so she panics and her hands go to the cat that's attacking her, and she doesn't shoot Nora. It's very clever. It's very good. Sometimes writers get stuck in corners, and I think the cat was a great way to get us out of that corner. And also, it's in terms of literary tools, it's hilarious because in writing, something that a metaphor that is often used to describe a part of the writing process is the saving the cat moment. And so it's a saving the cat moment, but the cat is saving Nora. Nora is not saving the cat. It's funny. I love it. It's great. I love the cat. And now it's time for the things that only kind of worked. Things that I thought were great but could have been better. Things that there were parts of it I loved, but I ultimately was disappointed in the end. The Callahan car crash. So the first piece of tension before we're really aware that there's a copycat killer is that Nora is at this bar that she regularly goes to. And this patient of hers, this ex-patient, shows up and he's like, "You're Nora Davis. You're the girl who saved my life." And Nora, in her internal monologue, is like, "Everyone knows me as Davis. I haven't been Nora Nearling in years." If you read this book, you're going to hear that phrase over and over and over again. And over again. I get it. I get it. So he shows up. He's like, "Let me buy you a drink." And Nora's like, "No, thank you." And he's like, "Oh, what? You don't want to buy a drink from me?" And she's like, "No, I don't want to drink from you." And he gets mad. He has to get kicked out of the bar. Brady is bartending at this point.
The bartender was no fucking accident.
Nora doesn't know it's Brady. Brady knows it's Nora, but she hasn't recognized him yet. And Brady's like, "Get out of the bar." He leaves. Nora pays for her stuff. She goes home, and someone Someone is following her home. There you go. It's a great first act tension because someone is stalking Nora home. Who is this person? Is it the copycat killer? What is going on? It's a great beginning, and getting us into the genre. You know, this stalking is basically telling us we're in a thriller. We're in a thriller. Someone's stalking her. We're in a thriller. It's a great way to start it. Love it. Love a good first act tension. It was great. There's a payoff for this, right? This car follows her a couple of times, and then in the last time it follows Nora, the car crashes. Now, here's what I can't remember. I can't remember if the car successfully follows her home, or if Nora manages to outmaneuver it and it lose track of her, so that way it never follows her home. I can't quite remember it. It doesn't actually matter because Harper is the secretary, so Harper could just look up Nora's personal details. It actually doesn't matter. What does matter is that the last time it follows Nora, Nora swerves at the last second and the car crashes into a tree. Yikers. And then there goes Car Crash Man in his blue truck. He is gone. But we do get a secondary payoff for this. So in the third act, right, this was great first act tension. This is the planted gun. But now we need the gun to go off in the third act. And it does, and it's great. So what happens is that Callahan, the guy who tried to buy Nora a drink at the bar, and Nora was like, no. The person we have thought this entire time to have been the one stalking her shows up and is like, I'm so sorry for acting like that. I was drunk. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm so sorry. And Nora's like, I forgive you. She's very uncomfortable about this, reasonably so. Nora thinks this man stalked her. This man has no idea that Nora thinks that. He thinks that he was just a jackass at a bar.
Can I buy you a soda? No.
This is a time where Nora doesn't have to show him empathy or compassion or sympathy. She doesn't have to do any of that. She is undoubtedly the victim in this situation. He harassed her. She doesn't have to be kind to him. Even someone who isn't a sociopath would not have to be kind to him. But the fact that she chooses compassion says a lot about her character. Again, she's a sociopath, so these things don't come naturally to her. It means that she's actively choosing to be this way because she wants to be that way. So Nora affords him the only sympathy that she can muster, which is, I'm sorry about your car crash. That's it. That's the only nice thing she has to say. That at least, that's the polite thing to say. I'm sorry about the car crash. But then Callahan says, what car crash? What do you mean? What car crash? What do you mean? Callahan wasn't in the car crash. It was another blue truck, not the one he was driving. Who drove the car? When did they crash? Who crashed the car? What is going on? That is just the bait and switch of that was so clever because suddenly it's like this was an isolated incident unrelated to the copycat murders, and now does that have something to do with the copycat murders? The tensions are thick. The cops are closing in. More evidence is being planted in all of Nora's personal effects. She's alone because Brady has abandoned her. She doesn't know who to trust. And after all of this overwhelming things, now she learns that Callahan was not the person who crashed. This girl's one bad day from a mental breakdown.
I've had a really bad day.
If she's not gonna send herself up the river, she's gonna send someone else up the river. Oh my goodness, it was so good. At the 44% mark, I checked my notes. That's when I listed who I thought it was. I thought that the world logic was pointing at Brady or Philip as the potential copycat killers. And then I wrote down also Sunny and Harper. Harper the secretary, Sunny, Harper's boyfriend. I usually make two lists when I'm doing thrillers of who the world logic says it's going to be and who I think the author picked. And I was right to make the list of who I think the author picked because it was Harper and Sunny were both working together to be the copycat killers. I had felt that McFadden was going to gotcha twist us. I really did. So I was more willing to believe that. I think at the end I was like, it's either Sunny or it's Philip. And Sunny was involved and Philip was the red herring. Of course I was going to think it was Philip. Frida McFadden spent all of that time giving us an amazing levels of evidence and planting phenomenal work for just to be a red herring. I'm cutting fish out of my diet. You must now be wondering, if I haven't mentioned it already, which I can't remember if I did. So you must be wondering, Aaron, who was in the car? It's Sunny. It's Sunny. It's Harper's boyfriend, Sunny. Harper was pulling off the copycat murders and she was asking Sunny for help. In this moment, she's like, Sunny's gonna propose to me. And then the next day, she's like, Sunny broke up with me. Sunny didn't break up with her. Sunny got in a car crash. And she had to make up a lie as to why she was so upset. I just think if McFadden had handled it better, I think I would have been okay with Sunny's involvement. Because at that point, I was like, he's probably involved. Harper brings him up way too often. For a character who, like, we never see, he gets talked about enough where I'm like, he's important. He's important. You wouldn't be talking about him this much if he wasn't important. Because the Callahan crash, the bait and switch was so good that I was like, I'm here for it. I want to know who was in that car. So why didn't Sunny work for me? I'm gonna tell you why, because I have receipts as to specifically the moment where I was like, well, now that it's Sunny is stupid. I've said this over and over again, that Frieda McFadden doesn't want us to know who the killer is until she's revealed it. And then after she's revealed who the killer is, then she kind of goes through this dog pile of clues that we quote unquote missed. But we didn't miss them because she didn't put them there. And part of that dog pile is explaining that the guy in the ICU is Sunny. Who really is Sunny? So Sunny is the boyfriend of Harper, and these two are in LOVE, love. Kind of unclear of like what Sunny exactly was doing, but Harper basically ropes him in to help her do the copycat killing. Sunny is a part of that process. And then he gets taken out pretty early because again, Nora unwittingly causes his car to crash when she swerves at the last second and he goes right into a tree. Sunny crashes into this car, and when the newspapers report it, Sunny's name is never mentioned. And Nora just assumes that it's Callahan. And we need to not have the name be listed in order for the third act, I wasn't in the car, twist to work. I bought that, okay? A bad news outlet who is just trying to generate clicks. I could imagine that they kind of like glossed over it, wrote what they knew, and then didn't even bother to find a name or actually send in a reporter. You know, I was willing to bite that that's why they didn't have the name. Or that Nora just didn't read it because she didn't care that much. Or because she assumed that it was Callahan. What I did not buy, what I did not bite on, is that Sunny was admitted into the hospital that Nora works at. This is the part where the private practice and the hospital parts get all confusing. I don't really understand how it works, and Frieda McFadden is a physician, so I trust that she knows how to write what her own field is. I'm not doubting the authentic. I doubted it at first, and then I learned she was a physician. I'm like, okay, she knows what she's talking about. At least she should be. So I'm willing to be like, you know, this works. I simply implore to Frieda McFadden that you seem to know what you're talking about when you describe this like hospital, but also this private practice. You seem to understand all of the nuances. I don't, and I have an above average knowledge of hospitals and the medical industry because of my personal history, my family's personal history. I have been in and out of hospitals all of my life. So and I was still confused. So I would implore more clarity with the hospital stuff. You know, pretend that you are trying to explain to this stuff like a kindergartner. Like we're all big dumb stupid idiot babies. This is the one time where you're like, yeah, you want to be specific and crystalline because you understand it because you live in it, and that kind of can sometimes make it harder to explain things. So that's my one thing, is that I trust that you know how hospitals work, and whatever this sort of duology hospital private practice stuff, I trust that you know how that works. You just need to be a little bit more clear because I was confused. Also, where was the anesthesiologist? Question. Miss Doctor Lady Frieda McFadden, Dr. Frieda McFadden. Why do stories with surgeons never name their anesthesiologist? Do you not know what to name them? Mark. Mark. You can name them Mark. Mark is the correct answer, in fact. I'm pretty sure my little brother's anesthesiologist is named Mark, and he was great. Do you know how hard it is to find doctors who fit really well with someone who has a more severe form of Down syndrome? It's not easy. It's really not. Not all doctors want to play ball with a 21-year-old who will fight you to the death if it means you don't poke him with a needle because he can't understand that he needs it for his health. So let it be known from this point on, all unnamed, unmentioned anesthesiologists, they're all Mark now. You are writing a story that involves a surgeon. Your anesthesiologist now is named Mark. No gods or kings, only Mark. I got sidetracked. Sunny. Okay, so Sunny is in the hospital in the ICU, and Nora, this is the part where she is sneaking in to find a patient, and she lies and says, I'm looking for Philip Corey's patients, and the nurse is like, oh, Philip doesn't have any patients, and Nora's like, that's weird, and the nurse is like, oh, and Nora's like, and she just kind of leaves. But none of the nurses are gossiping about Sunny being in the ICU. Philip isn't gossiping about it. Nora's not hearing the gossip. For a facility that seems to gossip a lot about Nora, where Harper is the secretary, you would think that Sunny being admitted into the ICU would be a big deal, but nobody's talking about it. And Harper obviously can't be upset about it because she, asked him to stalk Nora, so she has to run the lie that Sunny broke up with her. So I understand why Harper is not gossiping about it. I can buy enough that Harper is working the lie so it's not getting talked about a lot, but you would think that it would get mentioned. I'm like middle ground on how much I really believe that the hospital just doesn't know that Harper's boyfriend is in the hospital. Here is absolutely what I do not buy, in which where all of this falls apart. When Nora finds out that it's not Callahan who stalked her and got the car and was in the car crash, she goes to the ICU to figure out who it is, and she looks at the name and she doesn't recognize the name, and I guess he's so intubated that she can't seem to recognize him on the bed, and it's possible that Nora has never met him. I would believe that Nora could not recognize Sunny if somebody put a gun to her head. She's so antisocial and doesn't hang out with anybody. I'd bite that. But the name isn't Sunny. She believes that it is somebody else. I do think she does say that the name is familiar, but because the nurse is like, hey, Philip doesn't actually have patients here, Nora feels like she's about to get caught in a lie, and so she flees. She basically runs out of there because she doesn't want to get caught by the nurse. When Harper is revealed, and then we have the dog pile of the clues you missed, which aren't clues we missed. They weren't there.
We got big questions at both of these crime scenes with no answers.
At the very end, Harper is like, Sonny crashed his car because he was following you. He would never break up with me. And Nora has this duh moment where she's like, oh yeah, that name is familiar because Sonny is the junior because he has his father's name. Exactly, so he's that junior. And because of that, everyone just calls him Sonny. What? Why? Why would you do this? This is what I mean when I say Frieda McFadden didn't want you to look at Harper ever, and she did these awful things to get us there. Where it's why didn't you just write Sunny why didn't you just write Sunny on the ICU? Why didn't you tell us what his real name was before this? Why was she so afraid of us suspecting Harper that she purposely hid everything so that way at the end we're just like, what? What? Because you know how cool it would have been if she had gotten to the ICU and it's Sunny and then suddenly it's like, is it Brady? Is it Philip? Is it Harper? But we didn't get that. How do we get in the same book the phenomenal planting of what is Philip, but then also some of the worst shoving in at the end kind of nonsense. Philip was so good. Do more of that. Never do this Sunny trick. That was not fun. It was just like, what do you mean? Well, that's convenient. If Sunny's name was revealed at the ICU, you still don't need to confirm it's Harper. If you really want to sell us on the Philip Corey as the red herring, Nora could make wild, incorrect assumptions. Maybe Nora paid Sonny to stalk her, and then maybe, because Philip knows her so well that Nora would try to lose him so he doesn't go to her house, and, he knew that they would crash, and this was all a part of some grand plan, and Nora doesn't have to be right. But she just needs to believe that she's right in order for us to kind of bite into it. Something that sounds smart enough, but if you put some thought into it, doesn't make sense at all. It's just a distraction. It's trying to distract us from logic and that it's Harper. Nora can just believe wildly incorrect things. She's done it before. Why not now? It's entirely possible that you just make the wrong assumption about people and act accordingly. That's what she does with Brady. Because when people are scared, they don't think rationally. So you could get away with her still trying to rationalize it as Philip. You could, you just have to put the work into it. It's alright if the readers can kind of figure out who did it before the reveal. Like, it's okay to do that. That's why I'm so back and forth about the Callahan crashing, because it's clever and it's cool, and the bait and switch is executed at the exact right time, but at the same time, because we had to jump through some amazing hoops to get to Sunny, it didn't feel good at the end. So we have now talked about Philip, we have talked about Sunny. It's now time to talk about gorgeous and delicious Brady. Bartender man. I don't know his last name. It doesn't matter. His job is to be hot, and he does that very well. He is a computer tech whiz whose startup company failed, and so he's out of a job from Silicon Valley, and now he is in this hodunk town as a bartender trying to make ends meet. All the while, he went through a messy divorce and is a single dad to his daughter that he gets on weekends. What's not to love about this man? It could be the fact that he has a mask of his girlfriend's father's face. That could be a reason not to like him. It's so good. So, this is a very small part of the red herring because it's never pointed out as a possibility, to the point where I don't even think Frida McFadden actually considered this. But the fact is that the copycat killer has to be able to get information from Nora's patients. They have to get information from Nora's files. How do you get that information? You either have to be one of her coworkers, or you have to have computer skills to be able to hack into a system and get it. Brady, it just happens to be, I think he's a software engineer. You could write in that he knows how to hack. That's not a leap. Most people kind of are like, oh, you do technology, be a hacker. Computers plus hacking, right? It's not too far of a place to leap, right? We get it. So we could believe within reason that Brady could still potentially be the copycat killer because he could have hacked in and taken that information. We would just need to see some sort of evidence of a security breach. He would plant that there was a security breach. And Frieda McFadden could have done that, like an unrelated security breach that Nora's like, oh, it's gotta be Brady, but then it did not steal even her records or even go in there. It stole somebody else's. That would have been kind of like a fun red herring to distract us for a little bit. Brady was a good red herring, roughly 85% of the time. Half of that comes from old landlady, grandma landlady with her dementia. I love grandma landlady. She was the best. Keep doing what you do. Brady's a love interest. He and Nora dated in college, broke up, and then their love kind of rekindles throughout the plot of The Locked Door. And Brady, as a red herring, he's Mr. Coincidence. Everything that, is his, you're guilty, is just literal sheer coincidence. And for the most part, that worked for me. Sometimes, some people are just kind of wrong place, wrong time kind of people. Coincidence one is the locked door in his apartment. I mentioned that before. Nora, the first time she goes there, he lies and says it's a working office because he doesn't want to tell her right away that she's, he's got a daughter. He doesn't want to tell a one night stand that he has a daughter. I feel like it's very reasonable. Nora doesn't think it's reasonable, but I sure do. And as the title suggests, the locked door is a reoccurring theme. We're supposed to be looking out for the locked doors. And look, in Brady's apartment, there's a locked door. What's in that locked door? I don't know. Ask J.J. Abrams. Like I said, it ends up being his daughter's bedroom. He's a divorced dad. Another Mr. Coincidence is that Brady started working at this bar around the same time the copycat murders started happening.
The bartender was no fucking accident.
Again, it's just a sheer coincidence, but Nora's like, that means he's it. The victim's hand is found in the back of Nora's car, and that happened. That was incredibly wild because she was like getting gas and like opened up the back of her trunk and was like, oh my god, there's a hand, and there's like an employee that's like a few feet away, and she's like shuts the trunk and flees. That was great. But the last person who was in her car was Brady, because at one point Nora's tires get slashed. So Brady offers to help get them unslashed, call the tow company and all that kind of stuff. And Nora presumes that Brady had slashed the tires in order to, you know, with her tires slashed, he then has to drive her home. Now he knows where she lives. Nora thinks that was done on purpose, and then also because he got the tires fixed for her, and he insisted on doing that. He must have put the hand in there at that time because he's a copycat serial killer who has her dad's mask in his closet.
Why did he do the bartender?
And then again, with the tires slashing, that's another Mr. Coincidence. Again, Nora thinks that was on purpose. You could either assume Harper did it out of rage, or one of the victims of the copycat killer's mother tracks down Nora and is like, I know who you are. And you could think that maybe she slashed the tires out of rage. It's never confirmed. It never needs to be confirmed. There's a lot of people angry at Nora right now. So, literally, everyone could have just taken a tire. Here's where we get to the part where I'm like, middle ground as a red herring. You kind of lost me there. Is the Brady doesn't have a daughter scene at the very end of the third act. Well, I mentioned with Grandma Landlady that she at the very end is like, I swear to you, he's killing women up there. They scream and I hear it all night. And the nurse is like, she has dementia, I'm so sorry. And Nora's like, hey, maybe you're hearing like his daughter's giggles and shrieks of laughter. She's a small child. She's probably very loud, and she's just interpreting that as screams. And the nurse or the niece or whatever, she's like, oh, Brady doesn't have a daughter. What? What do you mean? What were you doing, Frida? I'm desperate for answers. And then Nora looks into Brady's car, and there is no booster seat.
Booster seat, hot dog.
So it must be true that he doesn't have a daughter, because there's no booster seat. Well, actually, the booster seat is like a story. So when Nora's tires get slashed, she has to carpool with him to the home, and I think at that point she does know he has a daughter, but she's like, where's the car seat? And he's like, oh, she's big enough for a booster seat, so it's coming in through the mail. And he like shows her a picture of her daughter, and it's all fine and dandy. So when Nora doesn't see the booster seat, she's assuming that it's because Brady lied, and not assuming because the booster seat simply hasn't arrived in the mail yet. I did like that the old lady was scaring her at the very end, and in a time where Nora was very vulnerable and could not tell if it was Philip or Brady, and she has to make a choice of who it is, and I felt like the old lady was helping steer Nora into the wrong direction, right? It's like, this is the dark night of the soul, and it's gonna push us right into the climax. So Nora has to get back to her apartment into the basement, right? Of course it's going to end in her basement, because that's where it started. So how do we get her back there? You have to eliminate Brady and his home as a safe place, which means that Nora has to make the mistake that it's him and flee and go home. That's the only way to do it. If you want it to happen at Nora's house, you have to eliminate Brady. I just think the way that it was handled with the he doesn't have a daughter was just a very cheap way to do it. I feel like Nora could have just believed the old lady at that point if the nurse wasn't there and the lady was just kind of insisting and pleading. And then like maybe Nora does hear a scream, but Brady's just like watching a thriller slasher movie. There are other ways he could have done it that I think I would have bit into more, but I didn't bite this one. So the reason why I can't get my head around it is because the niece is very direct and very matter of fact. And at this point we have no reason to consider the fact that the niece could be wrong. There's nothing about her character to suggest that she might not know. Except for, I guess, you could assume that because she's not there all the time that she simply made a mistake, but, like, she's his landlady. Well, the old lady, grandma landlady, is the landlady, but Brady said he did it through her niece. So the niece should know that there's two people on that lease. So the niece should know. But she says it so matter of fact. Brady doesn't have a daughter. So why would we not believe her at that point? There's a difference between Brady doesn't have a daughter and Brady has a daughter. I've never seen her before. Nora can still have her dark night of the soul with both dialogues, but one of them seeds in doubt. The first one, we have no reason to believe that she's lying. The second one, she seems unsure, so we could, as readers, be like, she's probably wrong. But Nora can believe her because Nora is in the scene feeling these emotions and she can simply make a mistake. I think that would have been better if the niece or the nurse was just made an error of judgment and we understood it as an error of judgment rather than this weird, like, she doesn't have a daughter thing that was going on. It was silly. You don't want readers to make assumptions in logic that for pivotal plot points like this. It's the same way that you don't want to have it just be like, oh, well, Harper is the secretary, I guess, so I guess she has access to all of that information. You don't want us to have to do assumption work on something so pivotal as that. We want data to fully support the world logic. Otherwise, you will have cheap twists and frustrated readers. In games like Super Mario, the main skill is leaping from platform to platform. It's called a platformer. You're just jumping from platform to platform until you get to the end of the level, and that is how you beat the game. That is what the world logic of a book should be. We should be leaping around because that's what makes the book entertaining. The platforms have to be close enough together so that way we understand how to get across. The assumption work about the niece and Harper's access to information is like positioning the platform just a little too far so it's just out of reach. As a gamer, you don't want to have to go into the code of your platformer to edit the platform so that it's easier to access, because at this point it's not. And likewise, you shouldn't have to be making leaping assumptions in order for a book's world logic to make sense. It's an art form. The hardest part of writing is balancing being too predictable versus being too coy. And in my opinion, I feel like Frieda McFadden was just simply too coy for me. She held on to everything just too long. Again, she didn't want us to know it was Harper, so she did this dog pile lore drop at the very end, which was just frustrating and boring, and it killed the tension. It wasn't fun. Brady is touch and go for his role as the love interest and a red herring. Although I think and I want to mention this, the most interesting part about them is that Nora, for a while, she can't seem to remember why she broke up with Brady.
Why did he do the bartender?
Because she's like, he's such a good guy. He's so nice and generous and da-da-da, and then he makes this, like, aside or a joke about a slasher film, and then Nora is like, I need to use the bathroom. And she starts panicking because she remembers that he used to be, like, obsessed with slashers in college, and he used to have a bunch of masks from, like, famous fictional serial killers, like, who I wrote them down, like a Jason mask or a Freddy Krueger mask. I don't know anything about slashers. And he had a mask of Aaron Yearling, Nora's father's face, because he was just kind of obsessed with serial killers. And she broke up with him because it was too weird. That's so good. And that helps us maybe consider the fact that he's a copycat, that he has this kind of fascination with slashers, but not only does he have a fascination with fictional serial killers, but he clearly has crossed over the line and has obsessions with real serial killers, because he sees Aaron Neerling as just, Freddy Krueger or Jason. He's just another part of that mythos. But Aaron Neerling was a real person who had real victims and did real crimes. I mean, in the world, obviously. Aaron Neerling's not a real person, but in the world, he's a real person. We have all of these facts about Brady, and that Nora, in her Dark Night of the Soul, she has to decide, is Brady the copycat or not? And Nora makes a mistake and thinks that he does, and she runs. There's also something thematically interesting that I wish Frida McFadden would have leaned into more, which is that line between fictional serial killers and real serial killers. Fictional serial killers, that's fine. You can find Jason sexy as much as you want, because he wasn't a real guy who did real crimes and real things. But, like, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Gein, what? There's a fine line between morbid curiosity and an inappropriate obsession, and there are real people who use that line as a jump rope, and that could have been an interesting topic to talk about, especially with Brady having that mask and clearly is crossing that line from morbid curiosity to inappropriate obsession. Although it's considered, Brady says it's a phase, he doesn't really watch them anymore, so that's where that leans. I do think it would have been funny if Nora had to team up with somebody who was just a little too obsessed with Aaron Neerling. Like this super mega fan that thinks Nora's very sexy because she's a serial killer's daughter, and that like Nora has no choice but to trust this person and have them help her because she has no one else to turn to. And that person's character arc throughout the story could be realizing that their unhealthy obsession is harmful because Aaron Neerling in this world was a real person who had real crimes and there are real victims, Nora included. It's not a bad thing that Frieda McFadden didn't choose to really interact with this topic much. I just think it was a missed opportunity considering the cultural zeitgeist around how we consume information about true crime. All in all, Brady as a red herring worked most of the time, and it's really just at the Dark Night of the Soul where he failed as a red herring. It was just one trip, but he tripped at the finish line, and that's sort of a shame. So Nora is a sociopath. She is fine. I mean, there are points where it kind of gets on my nerves, but for the most part, we're telling a very interesting story about what it means to be a sociopath, but not really engaging in sociopathic behaviors. The active work that Nora has to make that other people don't have to make because empathy and compassion come naturally to normal people, whereas it does not to Nora. That's why I think the cat it plays such a important symbolic role of Nora having these intrusive thoughts and this lack of awareness, but at the same time wanting to be compassionate and wanting to choose to be an empathetic person. And I think that's an interesting story to say. I think it was just bogged down by mediocre prose, a bad villain, and too much repetition, but we'll get into that part. I've always believed that it doesn't really matter to me whether or not you have emotions or you have to simulate emotions in order to participate in society in a way that is meaningful to you, right? Some people don't even bother with it, and that's perfectly fine. But some people do. I don't think there's anything wrong if you don't really have the natural faculties to express and do things nascently, that you're simulating it with good intentions. I don't personally see that as manipulative. I think that you're just someone who's trying to fit in, and we shouldn't be judging you for something like that. It's two different paths to the same mountain peak. You're being genuine. You're not trying to manipulate me. You just can't naturally feel compassionate, so you're forcing yourself to, and it says a lot about someone. You have to choose compassion. That's it, and it's a choice for everyone. People who have the full broad range of emotions, it's easier for us to do because we have the ability to sympathize with people that sociopaths seem to lack. But the fact that, despite the fact that, a sociopath might not have those things, but they're actively choosing to have it anyways, I don't see that as anything different. I literally don't care. If you're being genuine and you have good intentions, what do I care? Whether or not it's store bought or handmade. But at the same time, sometimes the things that Nora says is psychotic. There is a scene where she has to do an emergency surgery and she describes this woman's skin as virgin skin. And she's like, and I love cutting into virgin skin with no scars because it cuts so easily. And I'm like, please stop.
Please come take us away. We really don't want to stay.
It is the craziest part where I'm like, I know you're a sociopath, but you really have to describe it like this is a little over the line here, all right? I'm giving you a lot of threshold, but this is really pushing it. So there are moments like that where, Nora is very profound in this character who is trying very hard to masquerade as a person with emotional faculties, and then there are sometimes where she is just unapologetically sociopathic, and I'm like, girl, girl. I don't know how I feel about it. I'm not a sociopath, so I can't. I am kind of like the opposite of a sociopath. I have too many emotions, so I can't really comment on the accuracy of this as a portrayal. All I can really say is that when she described that person that she saved in surgery as having virgin skin, and then she likes cutting into virgin skin, I'm like, maybe that was an inside thought. An inside thought that should have never have come outside. And by outside, I mean on the page. And we should have just not. I don't think we should have written that. I think that there are so many sentences in the world, and somehow we landed on that one, and we shouldn't have. So here's the thing about showing and telling. This is the first book I've read where I've been like, wow, they're really telling and not showing. So I guess that's an achievement. It's one of those things, like, reading growing up where I'm like, where you do the show don't tell, right? And everyone is always like, oh, they're telling not showing, they're telling not showing, and I'm like, I don't ever notice it at all. And I, honestly, this entire time I just thought I was a big dumb stupid silly girl who has no idea what she's talking about, despite the fact that I have a bachelor's in writing.
You know how wrong about politics you have to be for like me to notice?
I just never seemed to notice it, and then I read this book and I went, oh, it's because most writers are actually pretty good at it. And there's just a writer every now and then who's not good at it. And sometimes they become billionaires with very successful novels, and it's very good for you. And sometimes they end up having bestsellers, such as the case with Frida McFadden. And sometimes they just kind of fall away to obscurity. I'm willing to put out that most writers, 90% of writers, are good at writing well-rounded characters, are good with pacing, and are good with showing, not telling. And I'm pretty sure because, if these are people working with editors can at least catch the show don't tell parts and the pacing parts. So that's my hot take, is that most writers are actually really good at it. But if you go into any 1-star review of any book, literally pick any 5, everyone will always say flat characters, bad pacing, telling, not showing. And it's kind of funny to me because I'm like, I never noticed. I was like, am I just dumb? Do I just never notice it? No, most people are just actually good at it, and some people just add those on because they feel like it's not, and they're valid opinions. This is the first book that I've read where I noticed it. The first published piece, okay? Because I was in college and I read a lot of first drafts in my life, so I've definitely read a lot of show don't tell, but I've never read it in a published piece. If you, like me, are so confused about show don't tell because you don't really encounter it a lot in your books, and you're like, what does that even look like? Go read The Locked Door. Go read The Locked Door, and you'll see it. It's very obvious, and I know that Frieda McFadden probably would not like people reading her book to see something that she failed. But I would take the W, Frieda McFadden, at least that this is a teachable moment. At least you could say that, like, okay, maybe I was not very good at showing and I did a lot of telling, but at least, another writer can look at this and use this as a reference point. It still has use, and it's still something that is useful in society. It's just not useful in the way that you thought it was. So I would just take the W here. Take it. Here's my W. Free of cost. What does this book specifically struggle with? With Show Don't Tell, first of all, it's the repetition. Nora keeps telling us the same few things over and over again with, I haven't been Nora Nearling in a long time. Everyone will hate me if they knew who my father was. My father is currently serving 18 life sentences. We hear she repeats things like this over and over and over and over and over again. Frieda McFadden doesn't really seem to trust us in that, like, she has to over-explain everything. Like, Nora's like, I can't do this because, my father's a serial killer. It's like, no, we can figure it out ourselves while you're paranoid. You don't have to explain it to us. We understand. Your dad was a serial killer. You don't have to tell us every single time. But Frieda McFadden tells us every single time. The only scene where I have my rosy glasses on is the scenes with the cat. I can't actually remember if Nora does a lot of telling in those sections, but I don't recall the telling because the emotions of her with the cat overpower anything else that might have been subpar about those scenes, because we really got to see the way that Nora's sociopathy has affected her into her adult life. It was great. But yeah, for the most part, it's mediocre prose, and Nora explains too much and she says the same things over and over again, and that can get kind of frustrating. Asynchronous timelines. Asynchronous. A meaning without, synchronous meaning things are synced up. This is when the timeline is told not in chronological order. This is slightly different from a flashback. Flashbacks are just, you just kind of flash back to a moment and then you come back to the present, right? You don't. An asynchronous timeline is just a little bit different. The standard way that I've seen it done kind of over and over again is that you have the it starts. Right. So we start on page 1, right? And then as we go through the book, we have the present, and then we flash back to the past, and then the past timeline keeps going forward. So we're at the start of the book, we're in the present, we have some scenes, then we go into the past, we have some scenes, we go back to the present, we have some scenes, and then we go back to the past where the past left off. And so now we kind of have two timelines. And so the present timeline brings us to the end of the book, right? If we start from the present, we end at the end of the book. And then the flashback timeline typically goes up until we get to the beginning of the book. So the past timeline goes all the way until the beginning of the present. How do we get here? And then the present timeline goes into the future and to the end of the book. This typically, I don't know if this visual aid was helpful. This is typically how, like, I've seen asynchronous timelines work. And sometimes they do flash forwards where the crawdads sings did flash forwards. I mean, I guess you could argue maybe it's flashbacks. It's, whatever, right? So that's how it does. And then sometimes when you do an asynchronous timeline like this, you could do there is a time skip that happens between the end of the past timeline and the beginning of the actual novel. And this book does that, where it's basically the two timelines is Nora in the present, doing things in the present, and then the back, I think it starts on the day of her 11th birthday and then goes into like that whole week, because at the end of that week her dad ends up in prison because he's a serial killer. So it ends, and then by the time we get to where it ends, we kind of already know what happens to Nora between that moment and when the actual book starts, because we've seen that Nora has referenced back to all of those details. This book has an asynchronous timeline. Dramatic irony is when the readers know something that the protagonist doesn't know. In Star Wars, the prequels have dramatic irony because we know that Anakin becomes Darth Vader, but Anakin doesn't know that Anakin becomes Darth Vader, right? The audience already knows that that's dramatic irony. In Romeo and Juliet, the prologue tells us that they die. They don't know that they die. The audience does. They don't. That's dramatic irony. So dramatic irony shifts the question. It shifts it from, will this happen, to how does it happen? If you already know that's going to happen, you're no longer caring about the if it happens, it's how does it happen? How can sometimes be a more tantalizing question than if, when you do it correctly. My brother has always been more interested in the hows more than the ifs when it comes to storytelling for him. I knew the ending of Death Note and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood before I watched either of those pilots. My brother told me how it ended, and when I was like, why would you tell me that? He's like, well, because it would be stupid if it didn't end this way, So when I watched them, I wasn't saying, is this gonna happen? Will this happen? I was more as I was watching it is, how does it happen? And for those particular viewing experiences, I preferred it more. My brother was right, how can be much more interesting than if, but only if you do it correctly. Frida McFadden is not good with dramatic irony. She's not. And part of the problem is her stellar prologue. The stellar prologue kind of shoots the dramatic irony in the foot. She gave us this police report of Aaron Neerling's crimes. Very succinct, very good, very small knit, easy to understand. But because that prologue was so good, every time we go back to that, it feels like an unnecessary retreading of ground we've already been on and already established information. You could ditch the prologue or you could ditch the asynchronous timeline. And I'm pretty much team prologue. The prologue was great. You can do this without an asynchronous timeline. And like the flashbacks Nora has about her family, you know, when the past timeline ends and we're caught up to the present, you know, we know that Grandma takes Nora in. Nora changes her last name. Dad tries to tell Grandma, like, send her letters, but Grandma's like, no, you were a deadly laser. Go away. And then Nora goes to med school. Nora gets her residency. Philip asks Nora to have a practice with him. So, like, the flashing back moments where Nora is talking about her past, those are fine, but when we go into full flashback, it's not good. Because Frida McFadden has joined the leagues of Nathaniel Hawthorne in that she doesn't really know how to write children. The child doesn't feel very realistic. When Nora's like, oh, my dad's building down there, I wonder what's going on. We're like, well, no, it's not very interesting prose when Nora is wondering when we already know what's down there, and there's no real horror generated because it's like, yeah, he's down there, but he gets caught. The how in this moment is not, it's not tantalizing enough because we spend too much time in the back store in the past timeline doing things that aren't very relevant. I think McFadden has enough usable lore for one solid flashback, like at the midpoint. Ditch the Marjorie storyline. That was uninteresting and uncomfortable, and it really just, it didn't need to be there. You can ditch that. We don't need Marjorie. Just give us Nora the getting the pet, right? She gets the pet rat that she ends up killing because it's like a thing that she like sociopathically like experiments on her pets and it gets them killed. And then like Nora creeping downstairs, she finds the girl in the basement. The confrontation where her father's like, "You're like me and we could work together," and Nora's like, "Totally, definitely, yeah, Dad, we're gonna do that." The father could be like, "Tell me, is the mouse dead yet?" And it is spooky. Like Nora has this moment of clarity. Like, does Dad see Nora and this girl that's in the basement like the way that Nora sees the mouse? And then suddenly Nora can be like, "Ooh, maybe I shouldn't be treating animals like that because like my dad treats people like that." You know, are we all that different? That could be her sort of waking up moment. You know, she has to ask herself, you know, what is the difference between Nora and the girl in the cage? And Nora's like, there is no difference. And that could really help her bring in her humanity. Then she could like lie and be like, "Mom's eating too much," or she snuck in cake. And Dad could like storm into the room and yell at Mom, and Nora could like run out of the house and head to the police station to report him. The tension stays thick the entire time. There are stakes. There's a girl in the basement. She's alive right now. Nora needs to get to the police. She cleverly tricks her dad to distract him so she can run to the police. And maybe like there's just like a cop down the street that's like pulled someone over for speeding. And she races over, tells the cop what she saw. Speeding ticket guy leaves. Backup is called, but the girl is dead because Nora's father noticed Nora run out and saw the cop car, realized what was going on. And so maybe he like takes the life of the victim and then goes to try and willingly bite the dust. But the cops stop this, and that's why he ends up in prison. That could be, you know, it's very short, impactful, stakes are high story of how this man got caught. And we still get that Nora in her sort of at her most sociopathic with the way that she kind of kills the rat. And also how she easily manipulates her father into yelling at her mother, and she doesn't have any sort of regard for her mother's mental health at that point. She's like, "Oh, well, my mother's gonna get screamed at, whatever." Yeah, like a sociopath wouldn't care that happened. Nora just easily does it. You know, right now, this timeline feels like it just takes up space. It was there to finish a word count. And the dramatic irony just makes that all the more obvious. Like I said, Nora is like, I wonder what's down there. My dad is a good man. He does work in his basement all the time. And it's like, girl, who are you trying to fool? Why are we being so heavy-handed and obvious with that? It could have been better, but it wasn't. And my friends, it only gets worse from here. It's time. It's time to talk about Harper. Unfortunately, we're here. Twist film was stupid. I'll just be end credits, roll credits. I didn't like it. Okay? I didn't. I hated it, in fact. I got very mad, in fact. So the locked door does this thing where once they reveal the villain, they then do this like dog pile lore of all the clues that you missed, but you didn't actually miss them because you didn't put them there to begin with. And it's frustrating. Like Knives Out and Glass Onion are some of the best mystery thrillers out there in television right now because Rian Johnson, right? Is that Rian Johnson? Is that his name? He doesn't care if you figure it out. He literally doesn't. I suspected the maid in Knives Out from the first moment because I was very suspect in the way that she acted. I didn't find the way that she reacted to the guy's death is very believable. And if that of course wasn't all of it, but part of it. It's very rewarding for you to suspect something and be right. And Glass Onion literally shows you who does it and then they gaslight you about it later. And that's so good. They managed to make that work. Thrillers are at their best when they aren't scared of the reader figuring it out. Because it's with thrillers, right? The insult is that, oh, it's so predictable, you could figure out who did it in the first one. And so writers are trying very hard to be shocking and you're never going to be able to predict the villain. Why? I want to be able to figure it out. That's like the fun in thrillers and the fun in mysteries is trying to figure it out based on the information. And I wish that thriller writers were less scared of it, the way that Rian Johnson isn't very scared of it. Because, like, in one of Rian Johnson's interviews with Knives Out, he literally talks about how he uses Apple products to systematically eliminate every possible person as a suspect. That if you know the thing that like Apple will only let you use Apple products as long as they're not a villain. You can't bad guys can't use Apple products. So he used that to systematically eliminate everyone. And that's genius. Like he literally doesn't care. He's eliminating them for you. Like he doesn't care and it's great and the story is successful because of that. Frida McFadden is afraid of you figuring out it's Harper. So she doesn't tell you anything. So when we reveal it's Harper, now she's stuck in this corner because at this point, we've never even considered Harper a viable option, so now she has to go list by list, point by point, why it's Harper, and we just have to sit there like sitting ducks and kind of just trust her and believe her. And sometimes it's like, okay, I guess, and other times it's like, what do you mean that Sunny's name is not Sunny's name? Like some of them just become impossible to understand, and they just doesn't make sense. When I read Seven and a Half Deaths of Evelyn Hugo, no, Seven and a Half Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, I did not know who did it, right? The nature of that book, you can't track it, and that's just the nature of the book, is it's supposed to be overwhelming like that. He managed to get away with it because of the nature of what that book is. But I didn't know who it was, but I knew which piece of information was going to lead us to it because they kept mentioning this. Like this one lady, she sees something through a window and then she goes and talks to some maids downstairs. And the protagonist can't investigate it because everyone is trying to kill him and he keeps getting distracted. But I knew at one point I kept being like, that plot thread hasn't been resolved yet. And I was like, I don't know who did it, but that person knows who did it. They know something, and we need to figure out what that is. So I didn't get it, but like I knew I was on the right road. And sometimes that's enough. I don't always need to figure out who it is. I just want to be on the right road. Thus, Harper being our gotcha twist is just boring and unimaginative and typical. Like, of course, the villain is someone who we didn't talk about the entire book. Of course it is. We're supposed to be shocked that it's not her and not Philip. but you didn't do anything. And now we have to spend the climax, which is supposed to be hot and fast and dangerous, slowing down to explain every detail that you didn't give us. When Harper was revealed, I literally thought she was Marjorie. That, like, for some reason, Marjorie was coming back for revenge. And I was like, okay, sure, but, like, the world logic, like, Harper has to have a reason, right? And that's the only thing I could think of. It's like, maybe she's Marjorie. But, no. In the flashbacks, Nora's father makes fun of Nora's mother's weight all the time, and it's kind of sad. But it is a misdirect, because Mom is actually pregnant with Harper. And Harper is born premature after Mom willingly bit the dust. Harper's motivation to target Nora is because Nora is the one who reported Aaron Yearling to the police, and so in Harper's mind, Nora ruined Harper's chances at being with her birth family. She missed out on the chance of being with her really messed up family instead of her loving adopted one. How dare Nora do that? What are you, a psychopath? She had Sunny stalk Nora. She presumably had access to all of Nora's information because, again, she's the secretary. She also presumably stalked Nora to the airport to put the hand in her car. And she presumably just happened to overhear Philip gossiping about Nora hiring a security installation in order to avoid someone breaking into her home and planting more evidence. And I don't know why Philip would have done this to Nora, but even if it was a bad reason, I think I would have just bought into it more because of the phenomenal work that was done to set up Philip as a red herring. I mean, we can argue maybe that he's too obvious, but the fact is, the victims are Nora's patients. That narrows down the suspect pool very hard, very fast. The first thing to do to make Harper believable is to establish Mom is pregnant. Even if we never touch on Harper again, but we establish that Mom is pregnant, we could at least say that there was something there, right? Something to make this a little bit more believable than it actually is. Nora could be lied to and say that the baby died when the mother willingly bit the dust because the grandmother didn't want to raise it. Next, I would say that you need Harper to be working at the practice before Nora is there. We have this narrative that Philip tracked down Nora, so that way he could work with her. He singled her out. He really insisted. He was willing to pay whatever. He wanted to really work with Nora. And we could have had this discovered that it was like Harper who was actually really advocating hard for Nora to work at that practice. Philip could say over and over again, like, oh, Harper wants to be just like you, and Nora could kind of interpret this as a dumb through line that doesn't mean anything, but, you know, in the end, we could have discovered that, you know, maybe an email correspondences between Harper and Philip, that Harper's kind of last plea, last ditch effort of like, hey, pay attention to this doctor is like, I want to be like her. And so Philip is constantly referencing that. And Harper, I think she's like pretending to go to med school. So like there's some buy into like Harper potentially idolizing Nora Davis. Like there's the point that's right at the dark night of the soul when Philip and Harper leave to go on a date together. So Nora has time to like look through files and things and potentially find that portfolio or find those emails between Harper and Philip about hiring Nora. Another point is that the detective, whose name I don't even remember, they go to Nora's workplace to harass her, and Harper has to get Nora every single time because Nora is the secretary. Harper could slip up and say one of the victims' names before she actually is supposed to know it. And then Frieda would have two choices. She would either never bring that up, and it was just something that we're supposed to realize and go, oh! Or Harper could, like, taunt Nora with it, being like, I even said her name before I was supposed to know who it, and you didn't even think about it. Because, of course, why would Nora think about it? This is Harper. Harper's a sweet, precious baby angel. She could not do anything wrong ever. You would never suspect her. I think that all of the red herrings that implicate Philip should slowly transition from Philip to Harper throughout the course of the novel. So that way, you know, by the time we're at the end, we don't have to dogpile you with all of this information, and when we can kind of understand that every piece of detail that implicated Philip actually implicated Harper, and Harper just cleverly hid underneath Philip. Because right now she's still hiding under him, but it's not clever. And part of that could be the cup scene, right? The cup. I keep bringing up this cup. It goes missing from Nora's work, and then it shows up at a crime scene. And Nora makes this assumption that Philip broke it and threw it away. But actually, if you could have Harper lie and say Philip broke it and threw it away, then when Harper is revealed to the killer, we can go back in time and be like, wow, we thought it was Philip because Harper straight up lied to Nora. You know, we would have one of those moments where you're like, I can't believe I missed that because it seems so innocent because she's the secretary and she's a sweet precious baby angel who would never hurt anybody. I totally promise. Finally, make it known that Sunny is in the ICU. No reason to hide it. You know, she was never on the playing board because, again, Frida McFadden didn't want you to ever think it was her and therefore didn't plant any evidence to implicate her. You just have assumption work and the lore that comes after the reveal. It didn't work for me. It worked for others. Obviously, this novel is average rating is 4 stars and it's a New York Times. I don't actually know if it's a New York Times bestseller, but it's a bestseller. So obviously people disagree and they like the fact, but for me, it didn't work. I'm sure this cliche has a name, but I'm deciding to call this incompetence. When fictional cops are just idiots and they cause more problems than they should because they can't seem to do their job. And not in a funny Shakespeare way. In a, wow, the writer really doesn't want the cop to solve anything and it shows kind of way. Just to send me up the river, I can't take this anymore kind of way. Please, please. Gone Girl, before she was found, the maid, the maidens, Cyberstorm, the Locked Door, they all do this. They just have cops who just no idea what they're doing. Why do they have a gun? Don't give them a gun. They can't do anything. And I get that not every detective is a good detective and not every fictional cop is a good cop. But you know, these cops aren't bad at their jobs because they're corrupt individuals with biases and problems that cause them to fail to do their job. They're bad at their job because the author needs them to be bad, and it's very obvious. You know, crime thrillers, usually they're gonna have police involved, right? You would think. And it gives you an angle to work with. Are the protagonists working with the cops like Nick in Gone Girl? Or are they avoiding the cops because they don't trust their motivations, like with Nora and the Locked Door? There's a lot you can do with police force and crime thrillers to keep tension high and to push the story forward. I have ample confidence in Frieda McFadden's representation of the medical industry because, like I said, she is a doctor, but I do doubt what she knows about the police industry and just the prison industry and the crime industry. There was something incredibly bare about the detective, so much that I can't even remember his name. They show up a few times when Nora is at work. They track down Nora's home address at one point to rattle some answers out of her. But there's no clear procedure. It doesn't feel like the detective is actually a part of the police force. Part of the problem is that I have issues that the detective would label Nora as prime suspect number 1, simply just because of who her father is. But in the end, that's not incorrect because the copycat was one of Aaron Neerling's daughters. But you're supposed to think that it's irrational for the cop to just assume that it's Nora. But they weren't exactly wrong. They were like on the right road, just in the wrong direction. We didn't get a good enough window into the cop's view to really know if they had a vendetta against Nora, if they were blinded by bias, if they had actual more evidence than they did. The detective didn't feel like a character. It just kind of felt like a nuisance. And I would have loved to have seen more of the detective and maybe the detective's side rather than Nora's flashbacks. You know, if we could have done multiple POVs with Nora versus the detective and the race of the detective to implicate Nora and Nora's race to cover up the crime, cover up the planting of the framing, and also figure out who's doing it. Secondly, they find fingerprints of Nora's at the second crime scene. And she's not arrested or forcibly taken into question. The detective does kind of force and set a timeline and Nora has to go at that time, but it really does feel like, with the way that it's handled, that Nora is going in when Nora feels like it. There is no pressure from the detective. Why didn't they arrest her? I don't understand that. Fingerprints at a crime scene of somebody who died?
Arrest her.
And we don't see a picture of the cup. We don't see pictures of the crime when Nora goes in for questioning. The detective shows up one last time to ask where Nora has been when they're stalking her house, and then that's the last time we literally see the detective. They don't show up again. It's the silliest part of, like, what was this detective doing? They don't feel like a threat. They feel like an annoying gnat that Nora just can't seem to swat. I think the problem is that Frida McFadden tried to tell a story, a crime thriller, from the perspective of a suspect. And that can be really limiting very quickly, and I think that's the first problem Frida McFadden ran into, is that there actually isn't a lot you can do when you're the suspect of a crime. Especially if you don't want to arrest them, or question them, or do anything with them. If you don't, like, it limits you even more. Like, Nora can't investigate on her own. She can't break into an active crime scene because she could get arrested for trespassing. That's super illegal. All we have are these flashbacks that aren't entertaining, and Nora getting framed for murder. She goes to work. She goes home. There's another piece of evidence that's been framed to set her up for the murder. And then she goes back to work, and then the cop shows up to annoy her, and then she goes back to work, and that's sort of the cycle. We don't actually get anything, like nothing is actually happening. I think something had to give, and it didn't. Either Nora had to get caught with something or someone with the framed evidence, or Nora had to team up with the detective because someone is framing her, and the detective they're just gonna have to believe her. I did talk about, like, the midpoint. Frida McFadden, the flashbacks aren't really working, but I think there's enough in there for one solid flashback, and you could do that at the midpoint. Nora could, with her back against the wall, kind of appeal to the detective and be like, yeah, I didn't do this, but I am getting framed for murder. Could you help me? And then the detective, because the detective needs to know the whole story. Nora can give them the whole story of the relevant details, everything that she remembers about the night that her father got arrested. The detective needs to know, and then we get that midpoint flashback. And we know that's important because Nora is being framed and it's a copycat killing. So it has to be something about Aaron Neerling that Nora just isn't picking up on that the detective could, because the detective is a paid professional. Only Murders in the Building really said it best.
Get the who, the how, the why, and the why now.
If you're trying to write a thriller and you're looking for, like, a checklist of all of your bases, just that. Just follow Only Murders in the Building. Right now, we have Nora, a copycat killer, but no why and no why now. So let's say Nora and detective team up. Nora gives her side of the backstory. The most relevant detail is that she's the person who reported Aaron Neerling to the police with an anonymous tip. Nora is mad. In the actual story, Nora is mad that Harper, like, finds out that Nora gave that tip, and we don't really have any explanation of how Harper got that. It's just one of those things that we just have to accept that happened because Frida McFadden said so.
We got big questions at both of these crime scenes with no answers.
But maybe, the detective draws two conclusions by the time, Nora's done with this story. One, somebody got access to the police's anonymous tip data. And two, Aaron Neerling might believe that Nora did it, and he told someone about it. That gives us two lines of inquiry. Someone needs to check with the cops, and someone needs to go meet Aaron Neerling. And suddenly we have this team working together. We have two paths. We see a clear end goal, and Nora still has to go talk to her father. The way that Nora ends up going to talk to her father in the original, it's fine. Harper, like, places his letters in her apartment, and Nora ends up going to talk to him. But, like, that could be a stronger reason. If you believe that either somebody got it through the tip data or somebody got it through Aaron Neerling, you have to go and confront both of those things so the detective could go one and Nora could go the other. There's just so much you could do without having to make the cop irrelevant and just a dumb, annoying nuisance. And I think they would have felt more fleshed out if Nora had been more involved in the case as, like, a consultant or if she were a suspect in custody because her fingerprints were found at a crime scene to a place that she's never been. It's time to talk about theme. So, Frida McFadden has some contradicting themes going on here versus the good old nature versus nurture. With Nora, she basically says that we are nurtured in this world. Who we are is determined on the environment that we've grown up in. We're not born monsters. With Harper, it doesn't matter what environment you were born into. If you were born a monster, you are a monster. So the rest of this point about nature versus nurture, it does require me to talk about the way that Nora's mother willingly bit the dust in ways that could be kind of uncomfortable. So if that's not something you want to interact with, I would just skip to the next section. All right, so the act of willingly biting the dust is very serious, and I'm not entirely in love with the way that Frida McFadden handled it at the end. Pretty much up until the end, the mother's willingness to bite the dust was fine. It made sense within the story. There's something emotionally raw about, Nora's father getting locked up and then her mom being accused as an accomplice, and then she is no longer on this plane of existence right before the trial. You have to wonder, was she guilty? Did she know what was going on, and that's why she bit the dust before the trial? Thus, Nora feels very abandoned by her mother. She doesn't seem to understand why her mother would have done this, and it's very poignant. And there's depth and the theme is theming. But then we learn that Nora's mother was 5 months pregnant with Harper on the day of the arrest, and she willingly bit the dust in order to not bring another sociopath's child into this world. That's cruel. That is absolutely cruel. Nora's mother died a monster. That is an awful thing to do, and an awful presumption to make of a child that is not even born. But the baby was delivered prematurely and adopted with sealed records. Her mother's reason is that she couldn't, bring another sociopath's child into this world. She couldn't bring out another monster, and you can kind of understand it because I guess Nora was, she is a sociopath, and I guess mom didn't want that to happen. And at that point, it's like, okay, I'm still fine with it. Sure, this is messed up, but the mom isn't supposed to be a good person. We can interpret her as just like a bad person. And I understand that the adoption industry is a wicked thing, but you would assume at this point, given the severity of Aaron Neerling's crimes and a fear that his unborn child could become a sociopath much like him, that there would be care given to making sure she goes into a family that is going to be a good environment for her to give her the best chance that she possibly can. And now here's the part where I was like, this is too much. This is where the line was crossed. At the end, Nora talks about how she understands why her mother willingly bit the dust, that she even applauds her for it. And it's made out to be that this was this noble sacrifice in this attempt to strangle Harper before Harper would have had a chance to commit acts of evil. Let me be clear with all of you. Nobody should ever be brought to a point where they believe this world is better off without them. Nobody should be there. We should not be bringing anyone to that ledge. It is always a tragedy and a reminder that we are failing as a community to protect the most vulnerable among us. What Nora's mother did was tragic, and to say that she did it for a good reason is to believe that some people are just born monsters, and that's just not an ideal that I believe with. And so I think that Frida McFadden needs to pick a lane. Do you believe that our environment affects who we become, or do you actually believe that people are born monsters? Because it just doesn't seem like she knows which one she wants. She wants Nora, like, I've overcome my sociopathy, but she doesn't do it for Harper. And Harper
you would think that she had the best chance because Harper never lived in the house with Aaron Nearling in the way that Nora did. It's very uncomfortable. I didn't like it. We should never be remarketing it as a noble sacrifice. That's just disgusting. There is this fake spark of tension that I think happens at the midpoint. One of Nora's patient's mother. So one of the patients that gets killed, her mother fakes her way into Nora's office and gets Nora alone, and the mother is like, I know who you are, Nora Nearling, and I'm gonna tell everyone. Ah, panic, panic, the lady's gonna go to the press. And then she never does. Why? Why not do that? Why didn't we go to the press? Why did that lady just like, why? Why? This prompts Nora, when Nora realizes, oh, like she's gonna go to the press, everyone's gonna know who I am, it prompts her to tell Brady who she actually is, because she's like, Brady's gonna find out anyways, I might as well come from my mouth rather than the press's. And he learns out and he rejects her because he's scared of her, because he's like, you're a surgeon, you cut into people, you're just like your dad. They get better, they fall back in love, whatever, but at that moment, he's getting out of Dodgeball City and heading straight for the Rockies. He's gone, he is out of here. But nothing happens with the I'm going to the press lady. She just disappears. And there's just not enough tension in this novel, and I can see why Frieda McFadden let it drop. Because then, one, Nora wouldn't be able to navigate the city. I think Frida McFadden wanted Nora to be in control of who has the narrative, right? If it gets within the press, it limits what Nora can do if everybody knows who Nora is. And of course, people might not want to be her patient if they know who she is. So if Frida McFadden kind of wrote herself into a corner where she probably should have just not have had the I'm going to the press lady, because the corner was unwinnable. And sometimes in writing, that happens. You have this cool idea, you want it to work, but you just can't seem to get it to work, and you want to take those out of the novel. You don't want to just, we assume that she just decided not to because, right? You just want to cut those out entirely. And it sucks. It does. As someone who's writing a novel, I've had plenty of those moments where I'm like, man, I really loved this scene, but it's gotta go. I originally wrote that the main character knew who both her parents was, and I wrote this really touching father-daughter moment. But then when I went back, I was like, maybe she doesn't know who her dad is. And it really sucked to lose the scene of that father-daughter moment. But I was like, you know what? You gotta do it, because right now the story isn't storying. Something has got to change, and my story is now better for it. But, those scenes had to go. This is one of those things where you should have just cut it out because you couldn't get it to work. You put yourself, it ran you into a corner. That's okay. Just take it out. So allusions are a tool when you make a brief but purposeful reference to another literary work, and in a more modern sense, video games, movies, TV shows, whatever. Theft is when you copy from one part, from one section into and put it in your own, except for you change all of the names and you contextualize it for your world, but you did lift it from something else. That's theft. And then plagiarism was just when you copy paste something into your world directly, word for word, lifting something that doesn't belong to you. It did not get past me that Frida McFadden took the breakup plot from Legally Blonde and just inserted it into her novel. Harper says that she's getting proposed and she goes to this big fancy restaurant, and then the next day it's revealed that he brought her there to break up with her. We find out this is a lie because Sonny actually got into a car crash, but this is the story that Harper's telling. I think this was McFadden's way to introduce Sonny without him being physically present, so that way we don't know what he looks like, so we can't recognize him. But it was just uncomfortable. It didn't feel like an illusion. It generally felt like theft. An illusion is like in Stranger Things when Winona Ryder's character hears her son Will in the walls, and she starts ripping the wallpaper off, and then later breaks a hole. The wallpaper, I'm pretty sure it's brown, but the lighting makes it look very yellow, and it feels like a very quick,
purposeful nod to the yellow wallpaper, which is a story about a woman who is trapped in a room and she starts hearing people on the wall and begins ripping at the wallpaper. The second plot point that feels lifted from something else is a scene in the flashbacks where Nora lures this girl Marjorie out into the woods, into this patch of woods that's nearby a road. She pulls her out there and they're gonna play a game, and then Nora brought a knife, and when Marjorie is down on the ground, Nora she reveals the knife and then contemplates stabbing Marjorie, but then she decides not to, and they go back to the road and go home, and they never see each other again. It's a little too close to the Slenderman stabbing for me to be comfortable. And that was a real event with real people, with a real victim in the area in which I live. And it felt like it was a cheap and easy way to establish Nora as a sociopath instead of coming up with a unique narrative. And we know Frieda McFadden can do that. Erin Neerling didn't strike me as an obvious reference to some other killer. We can have our opinions on true crime influencing crime fiction. You know, I've read 3 psychological thrillers at this point that have taken the Slenderman stabbing and done a retelling of it. And I get more uncomfortable with each retelling. Because I don't know how the victim feels about this, and I don't love people profiting off of her trauma. It's just a very, very complicated issue, and for me it was too close for comfort, and the flashbacks weren't great anyways, so, you know, it was a sour experience on top of a sour experience, and I was uncomfortable. I've mentioned these flashbacks more than once. In the asynchronous timeline, basically it's the events surrounding Erin Neerling getting captured. And this basically short story of Nora tormenting Marjorie, this girl that's in our class. So there's bullying, and then there's fictional bullying. And fictional bullying is sometimes so over the top it's hilarious. It's pushing the nerd in the locker and spitting spitballs and getting called ugly because you wear glasses. You know, I got picked on every now and then in school, and in my experience, kids just want to embarrass you in front of the class. Like when you don't know any better. Like most of bullying is just taking advantage of kids who are kind of innocent. And when you get older, it does become more insidious, and it's more about gossip and rumor. Mean Girls really is the only film where I felt like they got an accurate representation of what it's like to be bullied, and more importantly, how girls bully each other. And, you know, perhaps this book is just simply too woke because these little girls, they bully Marjorie in such a masculine way. The woke is overtaking fiction. No, I'm kidding. They blow spitballs at her and they stick in her hair, and I'm aware that spitballs exist, but it always felt like one of those movie myths, like shoving kids into lockers, because I've literally never seen it. And I think what Frieda McFadden was trying to do was trying to paint Nora in an innocent light, because besides the fact that Nora lures her out to the woods and almost stabs her, when the girls are harassing her at school, Nora doesn't do anything. She also doesn't participate, even though she was like offered, like, hey, do you want to spitball at her next? And Nora's like, no, I don't think we should, right? I think Frieda McFadden is like, Nora has kind of a conscience. No, she doesn't. The act of doing nothing inherently sides with a perpetrator. Nora is participating in the bully by choosing to do nothing. She is just as bad as the girls who are throwing spitballs, because Nora is looking at this and saying it's fine. Girls will be girls. They'll just do it. It's insidious. She just sits and watches. Nora she's never a good person in her flashbacks. She's always just an awful person the entire time. The only good thing she does is report her dad to the police. Mechanically, every aspect in the story has to be useful. That's how I knew that Sunny was going to be more important than Frieda McFadden was leading us to believe, because he kept being mentioned over and over again. I see what Marjorie was supposed to be. Nora makes the decision in the woods to choose compassion over her sociopathy. We understand that Nora wants to live a life that is not like her father. She wants to be a good person. But it's a hard sell. And I don't think she got away with it, specifically for me, because again, the events are too close to the Slenderman stabbing for me to feel comfortable with it. And the cat does a way better version of showing us this. That Nora has chosen compassion. Like, the cat is just objectively better than Marjorie. And I also, I don't care about what happened to Nora when she was 11. Like, I'm not interested in this bullying storyline. We already know that Aaron Neerling gets captured and loses and goes to prison. We already know all of this stuff. It's just rehashing it. It's not interesting. It's not fun. Like with prologues, I have a bone to pick with epilogues. I don't like epilogues that just feel like a last chapter. Usually, they might have a time skip, just jutting us into the future of what it looks like in our protagonist, like months or weeks or even years later. Epilogues need to have a better sense of purpose. The Handmaid's Tale has an epilogue in the form of like this professor's lecture as they go over the fact that like this story that you just read, The Handmaid's Tale, is this like notebook and collection of papers that they found in one of these safe houses, and they don't know what happened to that woman. And it is just this interesting framed narrative that contextualizes the story we read, the country of Gilead, and all of that information. It's very long, but it's moving and interesting and everything that we needed. And it worked. The Locked Door does a time skip final chapter. It's not really an epilogue. It's just the final chapter. Nora and Brady are at a farmer's market because Nora tracked down Marjorie. She has this weird line of, I couldn't save Aaron Neerling's last victim, but I could save Marjorie. Even though the only person who ever put Marjorie in danger was Nora. What? That's psychotic. What do you mean you can save Marjorie? From who? You? The person who's causing the problem? We could have done an epilogue like the prologue of Harper's case file. I mean, maybe I would have liked to have seen that. That could have been interesting. We do get that at the end of the story. And then we get this like last minute at the very end, Harper's perspective. We get to hear from the girl herself. Is it gonna be anything interesting? No, it's not. In the beginning of the novel, there is this patient that Nora has, and it's very clear that the patient is beating his wife. And Nora tries to help the wife at one point, but the wife rejects help. And then later, the wife shows up and is like, "Oh, my husband like died of a heart attack in his sleep." And Nora's like, "Oh my god!" And she's just stressed because somebody is targeting her patients, and even though this one was innocent, she's like, it doesn't help that a third patient has died in the middle of all of this, even if it has nothing related to do with it. It's just stressful. And so in the last part of the epilogue, when it's just Harper's basically like, yeah, I overheard Nora telling that woman how to kill her husband, how to make it look like a heart attack. This is not a clever twist. Nora is revealed to be an unreliable narrator, and it's not good. Like, we didn't see it coming because you didn't do any of the work. Nora isn't smart for gaslighting her audience into thinking she's innocent because we have no reason to consider that Nora's an unreliable narrator. There is nothing in the novel that suggests that she would lie to us. In fact, we have the opposite, because the wife lied to Nora and says she wasn't being hurt by her husband, so all we can really believe is that the nurse doesn't want Nora's help. And that's not how you write an unreliable narrator. There needs to be evidence to make us doubt the authenticity of events. You know, Amy's journal in Gone Girl eventually starts wildly contradicting with Nick Dunn's perspective of what's going on, to the point where you have to decide for yourself who's lying, Amy or Nick. One of them is not telling the truth, and in the end it's Amy. Amy's the one who's lying. You know, in House of Leaves, you can't trust anyone. Johnny Truant's clearly insane and is always on drugs. Zampano is dead. You can't confirm anything about his story because he's dead. And the entire Davidson record exists, but half the cited sources and verified sections are bogus. And no one can find Davidson anyways. You learn very quickly that everyone is either lying or mad or both in House of Leaves. Part of the entertainment of the unreliable narrator is catching them in the lie. Thus, I don't think it's neat that Nora is unreliable. I'm frustrated. Why is Frieda McFadden so coy with her information? What was the point of doing this? Why?
Fuck! I hate your nonsense! I'm fucking leaving now.
If you write like you don't want people to know anything until you say so, you're just gonna end up a story with nothing. Alright, lightning round. Everyone was described as hot or ugly in this novel. Nora talks more than once about how her dad is handsome, and that's very weird. Okay? Who people find attractive says something about their character. I thought Nora was bisexual at one point because I think she was describing Harper as very pretty, but they're sisters, so obviously not. So yeah, it's weird when children, 11-year-olds, are like, my dad is very attractive and my mom is fat and ugly. Well, I bought in more to Nora believing that her mom is fat and ugly because if she hears her dad say it all the time, then she'll begin to parrot her. But yeah, even adult Nora's like, seeing her dad in prison and he's like, he's still hot. And it's like, girl, that's your dad. Stop it. Nora is insufferable. It never improves. Nora's lying about who she is, and she gets mad when she finds out Brady lied about her daughter. But Nora's also lying, so she's also a hypocrite, and it's never addressed. It's like, girl, what are you doing? She lists off every model of every car she sees. It becomes a plot point later that there's a difference between two trucks because they're made by different brands, and I thought that was like, okay, it was weird that Nora was like, this is a Ford truck every time, but then when it was like the difference between the brands of trucks that caught her mistake of which car crashed, that was cool. So I was like, okay, that's a fun payoff. And then this isn't even McFadden's fault. This is the audiobook narrator's fault. They use this very uncanny tone of voice with every character. I don't know how to describe it, but it was the most jarring thing to listen to. The audiobook reader, they did not do a very good job. Final thing, Nora is haunted by the scent of lavender because that's the air freshener scent that Aaron Neerling used to cover up the smell of the dead in his room. You need to do a better job at hiding the scent. Take it from someone whose dad's a felon. You can figure it out. But also, I related to that because I happen to be allergic to a scent. I'm allergic to the scent of cherry flavoring as well as cherry flavoring itself. But I'm actually allergic to its scent, and it was just very relatable. I was like, she just lavender triggers her and it makes her feel sick, and I was like, girl, me too. I mean, with charities, but that was nice. This book was rated 4.1 stars, average on Goodreads, 3.8 on Storygraph. It's considered a bestseller. So for all of you that loved it, I'm so glad you did. I wish I had the same experience, but I did not. I've linked a pro locked door review, someone who loved the book. It's done by the review is done by The Book Is Done, What Next? If you want to hear from someone who loved this book, and she's a huge fan of Frieda McFadden, so if you're like, I want some pro Frieda McFadden, you can head on over there and watch her reviews of Frieda McFadden and show her some love. I would not recommend this book. I rated it 2 stars myself. I had more fun taking this book apart, examining all of the pieces, than I did reading it, but I obviously couldn't have had that fun if the book hadn't been written and published. So thank you to Frieda McFadden for writing and publishing this. That takes courage and dedication. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Be respectful, be kind, and be ready for the next video coming to a YouTube near you.